In the grand theater of galactic politics, where species measured their worth in conquered systems and the ability to pronounce unpronounceable threats, the hegemony of razor-sharp things had established itself as the galaxy's premier source of overcompensating drama. Their leader, Warlord Zyx'thak the perpetually irritated, ruled 60% of known space through a carefully cultivated reputation for being absolutely insufferable to deal with. His empire thrived on a simple principle: if you made everything pointy enough and shouted loud enough about your terrible plans, most civilizations would surrender rather than endure the paperwork involved in filing a formal complaint. The remaining 40% of galactic civilization had learnt to navigate this reality with the resigned efficiency of office workers dealing with a particularly difficult manager. They nodded at appropriate intervals during Zyx'thak's speeches about crushing the weak beneath his spiked boots of destiny, filed their tribute payments on time, and privately wondered how someone could make armor so aggressively uncomfortable looking and still consider it practical battle gear. The hegemony's success stemmed not from superior technology or tactical brilliance, but from the universal truth that most beings would rather pay protection money than listen to another 3-hour monologue about blood-soaked conquest delivered in iambic pentameter. This delicate balance of intimidation and collective eye-rolling had maintained galactic peace for nearly 2 centuries, with Zyx'thak content to collect tribute while composing increasingly melodramatic battle poetry, and everyone else content to let him think his dramatic flourishes were genuinely terrifying, rather than simply exhausting. Deep in the neutral zone, orbital station mediocrity served as one of the galaxy's premier examples of aggressively adequate infrastructure. The station existed in that perfect sweet spot of being too boring for conquerors to bother with, and too useful for anyone to actively destroy. Its corridors hummed with the quiet efficiency of a dozen species going about their mundane business, maintaining the delicate machinery that kept galactic commerce flowing, and ensuring that beings from incompatible atmospheric requirements could share the same space without dying horribly. Among the station's small army of maintenance workers, one particular human had spent the last 6 months earning a reputation for being remarkably good at fixing things that shouldn't be fixable, and remarkably bad at showing proper respect for dramatic authority figures. While other species had learned to respond to imperial pronouncements with appropriate displays of terror or submission, the human seemed genuinely confused by the concept that someone wearing that much unnecessary metal plating should be taken seriously. On this particular day, as Zyx'thak's personal dreadnought approached the station for what was supposed to be a routine intimidation visit, the human was elbow-deep in a waste recycling unit, muttering about the engineering principles of beings who apparently designed their technology based on aesthetic rather than function. The approaching ship resembled less a vessel of war and more a flying cathedral dedicated to the worship of impractical architecture, bristling with enough spikes and dramatic angles to make a Gothic architect weep with joy. The station's main docking bay had been cleared for the Warlord's arrival, with representatives from a dozen species arranged in what they hoped was an appropriately terrified formation. Zyx'thak emerged from his ship in full ceremonial battle gear, which appeared to have been designed by someone who had heard armor described second-hand by a poet with a severe head injury. Every surface had been carefully crafted to be either sharp, spiky, or somehow both, creating the overall impression of a very angry porcupine that had gotten into a fight with a metalworking shop. The Warlord began his traditional arrival speech, a carefully rehearsed piece of theater involving lots of dramatic gesturing and threats delivered in the kind of booming voice typically reserved for announcing the end times. He spoke of crushing resistance beneath his iron will, of planets trembling at the mention of his name, and of the inevitable triumph of the hegemony over all who dared oppose their glorious destiny. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly adequate performance of galactic tyranny, delivered with the kind of passionate intensity that had cowed star systems and toppled governments. Which made it all the more surprising when someone in the maintenance bay started laughing, not the nervous, desperate laughter of someone confronting their doom, but the genuine, delighted laughter of someone who had just witnessed something genuinely absurd. The sound echoed through the docking bay with the clarity of a dropped wrench in a quiet engine room, cutting through Zyx'thak's dramatic proclamations like a plasma torch through tissue paper. Every being present turned to stare at the human maintenance worker, who who had emerged from behind a ventilation grate with grease on their coveralls and an expression of pure, undiluted amusement. The Warlord's speech ground to a halt as he processed this unprecedented response to his carefully cultivated aura of menace. In 2 centuries of terrorizing the galaxy, no one had ever responded to his presence with genuine mirth. Confusion, fear, resignation, and occasionally poorly concealed boredom, but never actual laughter at his expense. The silence that followed stretched across the docking bay like a rubber band approaching its breaking point, with every non-human present desperately calculating their chances of surviving whatever came next. Zyx'thak's armor creaked ominously as he turned to face the source of this unprecedented disrespect, his breathing apparatus hissing with what could charitably be described as barely contained rage, and more accurately described as the sound of someone having a very expensive mechanical temper tantrum. The human, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they had just committed what most of the galaxy would consider a capital offense, wiped their hands on a rag and shook their head with the kind of fond exasperation typically reserved for watching a child attempt to intimidate adults while wearing a costume made from cardboard boxes. "Sorry about that," they said, not sounding particularly sorry. "It's just, well, have you actually looked at yourself lately? I mean, really looked? Because that armor has to be the most impractical thing I've ever seen. And I once had to fix a toilet designed by committee." The collective intake of breath from the assembled diplomatic corps could have powered a small atmospheric processor. Several representatives began composing what they hoped would be appropriately groveling apologies on behalf of their respective species, while others started calculating the fastest routes to the nearest escape pods. The human, meanwhile, continued their critique with the clinical detachment of a professional troubleshooter identifying design flaws. "And the poetry," they continued, apparently warming to their subject. "Who convinced you that battle speeches need to rhyme? Crushing resistance beneath iron will doesn't even scan properly. And don't get me started on your pronunciation. You're putting emphasis on all the wrong syllables. It's like listening to someone read a technical manual while having an allergic reaction." Zyx'thak's response began as a low growl and escalated through several octaves until it reached frequencies that caused nearby communication equipment to emit sympathetic whines. His armor's built-in amplification systems struggled to process the sheer volume of indignation being channeled through his vocal cords, creating feedback loops that made him sound like an extremely upset robot having an argument with itself. "Silence," he finally managed, the word emerging with enough force to rattle loose panels throughout the docking bay. "You dare mock the hegemon of the razor-sharp things? You pathetic excuse for sentient life. I will reduce your miserable species to component atoms for this insult." The human tilted their head with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly irritating technical problem. "Hegemon of razor-sharp things? Really? That's what you went with? Not Emperor or Supreme Commander or even just Dave? And why razor-sharp specifically? Sharp would have been fine. The razor part just makes it sound like you're overcompensating for something." What followed could only be described as the galactic equivalent of a very important person having a very public meltdown. Zyx'thak's threats escalated from the standard template of conquest and domination to increasingly specific and creative descriptions of exactly how he planned to dismantle human civilization, piece by piece. He spoke of orbital bombardments and planetary sterilization, of hunting down every human in existence and displaying their remains as a warning to other species who might dare to question his authority. The diplomatic corps, meanwhile, had reached a state of panic typically reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. Emergency communications channels lit up across the station as representatives frantically contacted their home governments to report that someone had finally done it. Someone had actually succeeded in making Zyx'thak so angry that he might follow through on his threats instead of just using them for dramatic effect. Within hours, the Warlord's massive fleet had changed course, abandoning their routine patrol route to converge on a single destination, a small, unremarkable blue planet in an outer spiral arm that most civilizations had classified as developing and left alone as being too primitive to bother with. Earth, as its inhabitants called it, had been marked for immediate and total annihilation, not because it posed any strategic threat to the hegemony, but because one of its citizens had committed the unforgivable crime of finding Zyx'thak ridiculous. The human maintenance worker, seemingly unconcerned by the fact that they had just condemned their entire species to extinction, returned to their work on the waste recycling unit with a satisfied expression. They had, after all, successfully identified and articulated several significant design flaws in both the Warlord's equipment and his presentation style. From a purely technical standpoint, it had been a productive conversation. As news of the incident spread through the galactic communication networks, the consensus among civilized species was clear: humanity was doomed and probably deserved it for being too stupid to recognize obvious theatrical villainy when they saw it. The maintenance worker had broken the fundamental rule of galactic politics. Sometimes it's better to let obviously compensating megalomaniacs think they're intimidating, rather than pointing out their obvious inadequacies. Most species began the process of diplomatically distancing themselves from Earth, filing the appropriate paperwork to declare humanity a regrettable anomaly and no longer available for diplomatic relations. It was, they reasoned, better to sacrifice one annoyingly honest species than risk Zyx'thak's wrath spreading to encompass the entire galaxy. As the hegemony's war fleet assembled for humanity's destruction, the maintenance worker on orbital station Mediocrity was displaying a remarkable lack of concern for someone whose entire species had just been marked for extinction. While diplomatic channels burned with panicked communications and military analysts calculated the overwhelming odds against Earth's survival, the human was calmly reviewing technical specifications with the focused attention of someone working through a particularly interesting engineering problem. Their access to the station's databases had revealed fascinating details about hegemony technology that most species considered either too dangerous or too boring to examine closely. The Warlord's fleet, for all its intimidating appearance, followed surprisingly predictable patterns in terms of logistics, maintenance schedules, and operational security. More intriguingly, their technological advancement seemed to have stagnated at precisely the point where function gave way to form, as if the entire civilization had decided that looking menacing was more important than actual effectiveness. The humans' analysis revealed something that the galaxy's military strategists had somehow missed. The hegemony's ships were essentially elaborate decorations wrapped around fairly standard propulsion and weapon systems. Their famous impenetrable armor was mostly cosmetic plating designed to look impressive rather than provide actual protection. Their devastating weaponry was powerful but relied on targeting systems that prioritized dramatic effect over accuracy. Most damning of all, their entire fleet operated on centralized command protocols that treated individual ship commanders as little more than remote-controlled extensions of Zyx'thak's will. What the maintenance worker found most amusing was that the hegemony had apparently never encountered an opponent who simply refused to be intimidated by their theatrical approach to warfare. Every civilization they had conquered had followed the same script: panic, negotiate, surrender, pay tribute. No one had ever suggested the radical approach of treating their invasion force like a particularly annoying maintenance problem that needed fixing. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity was responding to news of their impending doom with characteristic unpredictability. Instead of the expected panic or desperate military preparation, the planet's population seemed to be treating the situation as an opportunity to finally reveal several centuries' worth of carefully hidden preparations. Defense installations that had been disguised as weather monitoring stations began emerging from underground complexes. Orbital platforms that had masqueraded as communication satellites deployed weapon systems that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years of normal technological development. The revelation that humanity had been deliberately concealing their capabilities came as a shock to the galactic intelligence community, who had classified Earth as a backwater world whose inhabitants had barely figured out faster-than-light communication. The discovery that humans had not only mastered advanced defensive technologies, but had been quietly installing them throughout their solar system while maintaining the facade of primitive development suggested a level of strategic thinking that most species found deeply unsettling. More disturbing still were the reports filtering in from across the galaxy of maintenance workers and technical consultants, humans who had been quietly embedded in critical infrastructure for decades, beginning to display knowledge and capabilities far beyond what their mundane job descriptions suggested. The human who had triggered this crisis was not, it turned out, an anomaly. They were representative of a species that had somehow managed to infiltrate the galaxy's most sensitive installations while being dismissed as harmless primitives. The maintenance worker on the station confirmed what many were beginning to suspect when they casually accessed restricted hegemony fleet protocols and began downloading detailed specifications for every ship in Zyx'thak's armada. Their security clearance, which should have been limited to waste management systems and basic life support, apparently extended to military databases that were supposed to be accessible only to high-ranking hegemony officials. "Interesting design choices," they muttered, reviewing the fleet's tactical organization with professional interest. Centralized command structure, single point of failure, predictable patrol patterns. And they've been using the same encryption protocols for the last 50 years. It's like they never expected anyone to actually fight back. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were taking place as humans emerged from their carefully maintained cover identities. The primitive species that had been dismissed as harmless maintenance personnel were revealing themselves to be the galaxy's most thoroughly embedded intelligence network. They had spent generations learning every system, fixing every problem, and quietly documenting every weakness of the civilizations they served. The maintenance worker made one final entry in their personal log before the hegemony fleet arrived. Note to self: next time someone asks why humans always volunteer for the boring jobs, remember to mention that boring jobs give you access to everything important. Also, remind command that theatrical villains make terrible strategists. All style, no substance. Earth's response to the approaching invasion was not the desperate last stand that galactic observers expected, but rather the carefully orchestrated execution of a plan that had been decades in the making. The planet's defenders moved with the precision of engineers implementing a solution to a problem they had thoroughly analyzed and prepared for. They had, quite literally, been waiting for someone like Zyx'thak to give them an excuse to demonstrate what humans could accomplish when they stopped pretending to be helpless. Zyx'thak's arrival at Earth began exactly as he had planned, with maximum dramatic impact and minimum tactical sense. His flagship, the inevitable destiny of sharp things, dropped out of hyperspace at the head of a formation designed to inspire terror through sheer overwhelming presence. The massive vessels arranged themselves in what the Warlord considered an appropriately menacing pattern, their weapon ports glowing with ominous energy, and their communication arrays broadcasting surrender demands in 17 different languages. What the Warlord had not planned for was Earth's response, which began not with desperate pleas for mercy or futile military resistance, but with what appeared to be a maintenance request. The transmission came from Lunar Base, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone typically used for reporting air recyclers. "Hegemony Fleet, please be advised that your current formation is blocking several shipping lanes and creating hazardous navigation conditions. Recommend immediate repositioning to designated coordinates." Zyx'thak's reaction to being treated like a traffic violation rather than an unstoppable force of conquest could charitably be described as apoplectic. His response, broadcast on all frequencies, contained enough creative threats and anatomically impossible suggestions to power a small poetry festival. Unfortunately for the Warlord, his dramatic proclamation was interrupted by what sounded suspiciously like someone snickering over the communication channel. "Sorry," came the familiar voice of the maintenance worker who had started this entire crisis. "It's just, you're doing it again with the dramatic pauses. And did you seriously name your ship Inevitable Destiny of Sharp Things? That's not intimidating, that's just awkward. It sounds like a kitchen appliance having an existential crisis." The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a comprehensive demonstration of why maintenance workers make terrible enemies. While Zyx'thak's fleet attempted to execute their traditional strategy of overwhelming firepower and dramatic positioning, Earth's defenses responded with the kind of creative problem-solving typically reserved for fixing impossible technical failures with inadequate resources. Hegemony targeting systems, designed to lock onto conventional military installations, found themselves unable to distinguish between legitimate defense platforms and what appeared to be orbital garbage collectors. Their weapons, calibrated for maximum visual impact, proved surprisingly ineffective against defensive shields that had been built using principles borrowed from industrial waste containment systems. Most embarrassingly, their command and control networks began experiencing cascading failures as embedded human technicians quietly disconnected critical systems with the casual efficiency of janitors emptying trash bins. The inevitable destiny of sharp things, pride of the hegemony fleet, and monument to intimidating architecture, found itself disabled not by superior firepower, but by what the maintenance worker cheerfully described as percussive maintenance. While Zyx'thak raged against this unprecedented disrespect for proper military protocol, human engineering teams had simply identified his ship's most critical vulnerabilities and addressed them with the time-honored technique of hitting things with wrenches until they stopped working. The Warlord's final moments of military relevance came when he discovered that his flagship's primary weapons array had been deactivated by someone who had accessed the ship's maintenance tunnels and methodically unplugged everything important. The fact that this had been accomplished by a single human armed with nothing more sophisticated than a toolkit and an utter lack of respect for dramatic authority represented in many ways the perfect metaphor for the entire conflict. As the remainder of the hegemony fleet either surrendered or retreated in confusion, galactic civilization found itself confronting an uncomfortable truth. They had spent centuries being intimidated by a military force that could be defeated by competent maintenance workers with access to the right technical manuals. The mighty hegemony of razor-sharp things, terror of star systems, and nightmare of peaceful civilizations had been brought low by humanity's refusal to take their threats seriously. In the aftermath, as diplomatic channels buzzed with frantic attempts to establish formal relations with Earth, the maintenance worker who had started it all returned to their duties on orbital station mediocrity. The waste recycling units still needed fixing, and the life support systems required their regular maintenance schedule. The fact that they had inadvertently exposed the galaxy's premier military power as an elaborate fraud, built on theatrical intimidation and poor engineering, was, from their perspective, simply a successful application of professional troubleshooting skills. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the difference between looking dangerous and actually being competent. Unfortunately for galactic peace of mind, they had also learned that the species they had dismissed as primitive maintenance workers were, in fact, the most thoroughly prepared and strategically patient civilization they had ever encountered. Humanity's emergence as a galactic power had been accomplished not through conquest or diplomation, but through the simple expedient of being good at their jobs while everyone else was distracted by shinier, more dramatic alternatives. The diplomatic aftermath proved almost as entertaining as the military confrontation itself. Ambassadors who had spent decades crafting carefully worded treaties with the hegemony suddenly found themselves scrambling to establish relations with a species that approached interstellar politics with the same methodical precision they applied to equipment maintenance. Earth's first formal diplomatic proposal was, characteristically, a comprehensive infrastructure improvement plan for the entire galaxy, complete with detailed cost estimates and implementation timelines. Most galactic governments found themselves in the awkward position of trying to negotiate with beings who seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept of diplomatic immunity, and kept asking technical questions about their planetary defense systems. Human diplomats had an unsettling tendency to point out structural weaknesses in government buildings during formal state visits, offer to fix broken equipment during treaty negotiations, and submit detailed reports on the inefficiencies they observed in alien bureaucratic processes. The former hegemony territories presented a particularly complex challenge, as their entire governmental structure had been built around the assumption that Zyx'thak was too dangerous to oppose directly. Without their theatrical overlord to provide direction, most hegemony worlds discovered that their actual administrative capabilities were roughly equivalent to those of a moderately competent municipal government. The transition to self-governance was complicated by the fact that several centuries of dramatic posturing had left them with impressive-looking but completely non-functional government buildings and official protocols that prioritized style over substance. Humanity's response to this crisis was characteristically practical. They sent maintenance crews. Within months, human technical advisors were quietly reorganizing planetary infrastructures, streamlining bureaucratic processes, and teaching former hegemony officials how to run governments based on actual functionality rather than intimidation theater. The sight of human engineers explaining municipal water management to beings who had previously considered themselves masters of galactic conquest became one of the more surreal aspects of the post-war period. Zyx'thak himself, stripped of his fleet and his authority, faced the ultimate humiliation, a job interview. The maintenance worker who had defeated him suggested with characteristic directness that the former warlord's experience in large-scale organization might be valuable in logistics management, provided he could learn to communicate without excessive dramatic flourishes and inappropriate rhyme schemes. The interview process was conducted on orbital station Mediocrity, in a small conference room that smelled faintly of recycled air and industrial lubricants. The fallen warlord's attempts to maintain his dignity during discussions of salary requirements and work schedules provided entertainment for the entire station crew. His insistence on negotiating in iambic pentameter was politely but firmly discouraged, and his demands for a corner office with properly dramatic lighting were deemed impractical given current space limitations. Eventually, he accepted a position in supply chain coordination, where his talent for elaborate planning could be channeled toward ensuring that spare parts arrived on schedule rather than conquering star systems. The maintenance worker, meanwhile, continued their regular duties with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully identified and resolved a major systemic problem. The waste recycling unit was functioning perfectly, the life support systems were running within optimal parameters, and galactic civilization was considerably more stable than it had been before someone had finally pointed out that the Emperor's new clothes were in fact impractical armor with questionable design principles. The irony was not lost on galactic historians that the most significant military victory in recent memory had been achieved not through superior weaponry or brilliant tactics, but through the application of basic technical competence and a complete inability to be impressed by over-designed intimidation props. The Battle of Earth, as it came to be known, was studied in military academies across the galaxy as a textbook example of how theatrical presentation could mask fundamental strategic weaknesses. Future generations of alien cadets would learn about the importance of functional design over aesthetic appeal, the dangers of centralized command structures, and the critical value of actually testing your equipment under combat conditions, rather than assuming it worked because it looked sufficiently menacing. The curriculum also included a mandatory course on human psychology, with particular emphasis on their species' tendency to treat existential threats as engineering problems, requiring practical solutions. The maintenance worker occasionally received requests for interviews from military analysts and strategic planners, all of whom seemed disappointed by their straightforward answers to complex questions about asymmetric warfare and unconventional tactics. The secret to defeating the hegemony, they explained repeatedly, had not been some brilliant military insight, but simply the willingness to treat their invasion as a maintenance issue that needed fixing, rather than an unstoppable force that demanded surrender. Years later, when the galactic community had finally adjusted to the reality of human competence disguised as mundane labor, the maintenance worker still reported to the same duty station each morning with the same toolkit and the same methodical approach to problem solving. The only difference was that other species now watched them work with the kind of nervous respect typically reserved for unexploded ordnance or particularly volatile chemical compound. The waste recycling unit had become something of a pilgrimage site for engineering students from across the galaxy, who came to observe the legendary piece of equipment that had been repaired during humanity's most famous military victory. Tour guides would point out the specific components that had been serviced, while simultaneously coordinating a planetary defense strategy, though the maintenance worker found this level of attention mildly irritating, and kept suggesting that visitors might be more interested in the station's genuinely impressive atmospheric processing systems. The galaxy had learned, perhaps too late, that the most dangerous beings in the universe were not those who announced their intentions with dramatic speeches and intimidating weaponry, but those who quietly fixed problems, while everyone else was distracted by more obvious threats. It was a lesson that would fundamentally reshape interstellar relations for generations to come, assuming anyone remembered to properly maintain the equipment used to record historical events. In the end, the maintenance workers' greatest victory was not the defeat of Zyx'thak's fleet, but the fact that they had managed to complete their repair of the waste recycling unit, while simultaneously saving galactic civilization. It was, they noted with satisfaction, exactly the kind of efficient multitasking that made humans such valuable employees.